This is Randall Root, and in this video we're going to look at how to troubleshoot an SSAS connection. One of the questions I get constantly is about why my SSAS project won't deploy or process, or both. And there's a lot of techniques that you can do to troubleshoot it, and once you've gone through those steps, you almost always will find the answer. So let's go ahead and talk about that. First of all, let me make an SSAS project. Now, I'm going to go ahead and create a data source. Let's see, what's a good data source? How about this one here? Which leads us to the next piece, which is the impersonation information. And here, there's a number of choices. Now, the choices aren't obvious, but they really have a major impact. I'm going to go ahead and use inherit, which is probably the worst choice, and move on. I should take the name space out of the name, etc., but I don't really care at this point. It's not really part of what I'm trying to accomplish. Next, you make a data source view. For our demonstration, I want to keep it as simple as possible, so I'll just put a couple of things in here. Now, I'll make a dimension for products. And I think that's just about as simple as it can get. I'll make a cube now. I'll just leave one measure. Okay, so this is just going to be this quantity of products sold regardless of any other combination of attributes. Not a really great choice in real life, but good enough for our troubleshooting. Now, one thing to note is that what we just did was we made a bunch of XML code. You don't normally see the XML code unless you right-click and say View Code. But all these files are just XML code files. It's important to understand that the process of the steps that get taken to take the code files and move it onto Analysis Server. When you browse your cube that you've just made, you won't be browsing it in Visual Studio per se. The client front end is Visual Studio, but the actual back end is Analysis Server, the cube server. The idea is that these code files need to be turned into a master code file. The master code file needs to be uploaded to SQL Server's Analysis Server. And then that code gets ran just like running SQL code to create a database. That code gets ran on your Analysis Server. Once that happens, you'll have an empty database with its cube inside of it. There are actually 3 steps that get taken to upload the code and fill the data in the cube and etc. The 3 steps are: you need to build it. Building it allows you to go through and do a reality check or a syntax check on the XML files. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 XML files. Building it will go through, look at the syntax, and it will build that master data file. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to right-click on the project. I'm going to go through and say, I guess I need to go up one level. I'm going to right-click on the solution and say Open Solution in File Explorer. There's my project, and right now I have my little code files. These code files, they look fancy with their little icons and all that, but in reality Again, they are just very, very simple text files. In fact, that's probably not even, I'll show you how simple they are. I just open Notepad and you'll see them. Cube is XML, the data source is XML, data source view is XML, more XML, still more XML, and so on. All this stuff is XML. So I'm going to go ahead and build this project. What it does is now we have new folders we didn't see before. We have an object folder and a binary folder. In the binary, a bin folder, you'll see a bunch of files in here, but the main file that's important to us is this one right here. This is the analysis server database file. This is the master file that build needs to make. If I were to delete it and build this project again, that file will magically appear, because that's what build does. It creates that master file. That master file is still another XML file. However, what's different about this particular XML file is that it actually can run in Analysis Server. If I make a new Analysis Server query window, actually I want to make a XMLA query window because that's a type of code it is. This is the code that actually goes through and creates the dimension and the cube and all the other stuff, including the data source view and set security and all the other pieces that make up a Analysis Server database with its cube inside of it. The act of uploading that file to Analysis Server and running it over there is called deployment. You deploy this file to Analysis Server. And often that's the first step where things go awry. You configure deployment by going to the project icon, right-clicking, and going Properties. On the deployment page, you'll see which server it goes to. If you do not change this, it will try to go to your local machine. Localhost works for most occasions. If I want to connect to my Analysis Server, I can either put localhost in here, or maybe another alias, like the word local. Unfortunately, somebody thought the word local would look prettier if they put parentheses around it, so you have to have that. The parentheses only work on local, or you can put a dot. All three of those do the exact same thing. They mean come back to your local machine. I usually type in dot. It's the easiest one to spell for me, and I hardly mess it up. From there, if you have a named instance, you'll have to add in the named instance, such as, I believe I have a named instance on here called SQL 2014 maybe? I'd have to look it up. I don't remember exactly what I called it, but whatever I called my named instance, it would be dot or localhost or local in parentheses, and then a backslash, not a forward slash, a very common mistake because people get used to the internet. This is not a network, this is a network path, not an internet path, so that won't work, but this will. And then whatever named instance you've made. If you're dealing with a remote computer and not your own computer, local, localhost, or dot will not work. For example, let's say I have a computer called, I don't know, N252-00 or 10. Now, I just chose that number because there's some schools I teach at that use a number similar to this. This would be the name of the computer you're trying to connect to. This would be the named instance. If I want to connect to my laptop in the other room, it'd be, I don't know, Randall's laptop. Or whatever I called my laptop. And then whatever named instance, if I have one. If not, I'm just using the default instance. This is going to be Randall's laptop. It is not case sensitive. Anyway, the point is that you have to change this for it to deploy successfully. The name of the project is what the name of the database is going to be, but if you want to, you can change it to something else. I will now go ahead and deploy, but if you watch carefully, it will say it's deploying and processing, and that's probably not what I wanted to do. The problem with it deploying and processing is that there are two steps happening here, not just one. Deployment is the act of it copying things up to the server. Well, I've got a lot of stuff here. Here's my test one. I'll pause it and get rid of about those. Oh, that's much better. Okay, so you can see the test database has been uploaded. And the way this test database was created is basically it just ran through all that code that was found in that AS database file. The act of building takes all the individual XML code and makes a new AS database file. The act of deployment takes that code, uploads it to the server, and creates it. However, the act of processing is actually taking and filling the data into the database in its cube. Now, this is a nice convenience, but the only problem is that if something went wrong with the deployment or the processing, you don't know which part of it failed. So I strongly recommend when you're trying to troubleshoot what's going on, go back to the properties and change the processing option to do not process. The reason for this is you want to know whether the failure, if you're going to get one, happens during deployment or during processing. It's an important thing. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I will now go back in Visual Studio and I'll deploy it again. This time it just says deploying. That's what I'm looking for. I come back over to Management Studio. And the database is there. Database is there, but it's got no data. That's exactly what it should be. The act of getting data to the analysis server database is the act of processing. Now, the act of processing means that I have to copy data from the source into the destination, which is our dimensions and cubes. If for some reason I don't have permission to copy this data, it's not going to work. One way I can kind of see what's going on is seeing how well it's going to work is I'll right click on a table and say explore data. Oops, excuse me. One table. If I can't get to the data that way, I'm not going to be able to process. If one of those tables is empty, it may process, but you won't have any data. So this is a good thing to do to check when you're troubleshooting. Now, I've got my machine pretty much bulletproof set up for deploying and processing. And so it's not a big surprise that when I go up here and run it for processing, the processing copies the data. It literally does a select query on the original database and pulls data over and copies the data into analysis server. Because my permission structure is so wide open in this, which is not the best security thing in the world, oops, I have no problem with that. But on most machines, including ones that you borrow from a college, perhaps your own personal laptop, or of course at your job, you won't have that kind of luxury. So instead, you have other issues that come up. Oops, I didn't mean to close that. I'll reopen it. Let's talk about the issues that cause the most amount of grief. That is back here in the data source. In the data source, under the Impersonation tab, you have several choices. As I mentioned, inherit is probably the worst choice, and the reason for that is it really should say automatic mode. And what I mean by that is it automatically switches between the service account and the credentials of the current user. Now, I am currently logged on as an administrator on this machine. Also, I've also given my service account access to my database, my underlying database. So when it automatically switches between the two, it can't really lose. Normally I wouldn't recommend using this feature. It's just way too loose, shall we say. The current credentials work all right in some cases, if your permissions are elevated enough. The problem is that later on, when it gets uploaded to an SSAS server, if you ever try to fill it again by going through and processing to get the next day's data, the security is no longer running from there as your personal credentials. Your personal credentials only run out of Visual Studio, and you'll notice I've opened this in administration mode. When you're in Management Studio and on the job, it's going to run under whatever credentials are defined in the data source. It's kind of hidden over here. You have to look for this magic button that magically appears when you click down here. Of course, that's only if you know that it's there. And then you can see and configure the screen. Now, if I were to put it in current credentials, it would actually run under different credentials because it's not using Visual Studio anymore. It would actually try to use the account of the service credentials in this case. Service credentials is not a bad choice, but it presumes that you've given the account that analysis server is running under access to the underlying database. Let me explain that for a second. If I open up my SQL Server configuration management tool, give me a second, I'll be on the screen. This is SQL Server's Configuration Management Studio tool. I can see that I have several installations of SQL. The current one I'm working with is my default instance of SQL Server and Analysis Server. SQL Server is where I'm pulling the data from. Analysis Server is where I'm putting it to. SQL Server is running under the account of MS-SQL, NT Service MS-SQL, whereas my Analysis Server is running under the account MS-SQL Server OLAP Service. That's a lot to say. Now, this account is what the service account is. This is like your name goes here kind of thing. That account is how the Management Studio is actually going through and connecting to your underlying database structure like SQL Server when you choose the service account option. Yep, I need to upgrade this in order to be able to see it. So what that means to you is this. Well, that account has the ability to make new databases, to make new cubes, to make views and other configuration files. What it may not have permissions to do is pull the data from the original source. In other words, if you think about it this way, this is the original source. If you set the service account to be used, that account not only has to have permissions to do things on Analysis Server, it also has to have permissions to do things on the underlying database. In other words, it has to have permissions to do select statements. Now, how you'll know is this. You'll be able to build because you have permissions to take those XML files and make a master file. If you can't get it to build, either something's wrong with the XML files that you've made, you're not logged in as administrator. Those are pretty much the biggest reasons it's going to happen. And you need to resolve that. If you can't deploy, that means the account that you're utilizing in your connection does not have permission to upload the XML code from the master file onto the server and create these objects. And at that point, you need to either change the account or give that account permissions. The service account typically has sufficient permissions to do that. Not always, but most of the time that's true. Of course, that will allow you to deploy, but it won't necessarily allow you to process. In a corporate environment, you really want to set up a specific account that has access to analysis server so it can deploy. Finally, in order to process, we have to have access to these underlying tables. Otherwise, the select statement is not going to run. Whatever account you configure has to have select permissions on those tables. Now, if you're using the service account, it's just a matter of verifying that in the database engine, to whatever server you're connecting to, there is a security login set up for that account. Now, I have one on here, but by default, it does not exist. You actually have to go through and make one. You make a right-click and say make a new login. You put in the name. It's Windows Authentication. Actually, I'll just make sure it's here. I'll paste it in here and hit check name. Okay. And then I go through and make sure that it has access to the correct database. In this case, my correct database is AdventureWorks Level 1, but it could be something like Northwind, or it could be pubs, or some kind of final database. So it could be anything. And then, once you've chosen the database that you want them to have access to, you need to make sure that they have read permissions by making them a data reader. Now, there's some fine-tuning you can do to this, but if you were to give them a login, allow them access to the database, and give them, in that one database, read permissions, that will solve your processing woes. Now, it says I already have one of these, so I'm getting an error message, but normally that should not be an issue. I have been told that sometimes you have to type in the word built-in instead, which is kind of weird. So somebody has told me that if this doesn't work, the word built-in may work. I haven't verified that or not, but what I've seen is that you just paste that name that you got from the configuration screen over here. Oops. The SQL Analysis Server configuration screen. Where'd you go? Right there. Get this account name, copy it. Paste it in there, hit the name check, and then make sure you give them access to the database you want to work with, and give them read permissions. At a minimum, that's what you need. Now, that service account will be able to upload the XML code, but also connect to the database and do the processing. Build, deploy, process. Each step is independent. Login failure. Could not open the database. Login failed. I have a feeling I made a mistake here. Let's see what I did wrong. I'm looking for DW AdventureWorks Level 1. I can connect there. Oops. Double click on that. I can connect here. but it's still not going over, so something is still wrong with my service account here. Okay, great. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So I'll come back over here, make sure I got a refresh on there, and I'll go back in here and see what happened. Chances are I just didn't give it sufficient permissions or clicked on the wrong database. That'd be my guess. I have so many databases in there, it'd be really easy to do. And if I look here, I can see I gave it to AdventureWorks Level 1, but I really need to give it to the Data Warehouse AdventureWorks Level 1. Well, that makes so much sense. Give them read permission by making them data reader. And we try again. Turns out if you process, it will build and deploy. If you deploy, it will build first. If you build, of course, it doesn't go any further. So I'm just going to go ahead and process. It does a build, it does a deploy, and it does a process. Well done. If you have an actual production environment, have a production environment, you probably don't want to use the service account. Instead, you want to give a specific Windows account. Here, you go ahead and put in the name of the computer. Let's see, this one here is, I don't know, I'll have to look. This one here is Northwest Tech-01. Northwest Tech-01. And then my name. This would be my login account. This is the machine name. Of course, you can also get away with aliases quite often. The only problem with aliases is that sometimes they don't work. Localhost may work. Local may work. Dot may work, usually does. If in doubt, put the entire name there, and you're always safe. This is also true if you're pulling it from a domain. So say you work at Microsoft, and Microsoft famously uses the Redmond domain. So I put in Redmond, and then my name of the account that I use to log in at Microsoft, or whatever company I'm working with. After that, I put in the password that I use to make my daily connections, and that's it. As long as that Randall account has access to the SQL Server, and actually they do. In fact, I went ahead and made them a system admin, so I can do anything on that server. I'll be able to work with it. The only problem is I may not be able to deploy, and the reason for that is that Randall account also has to have access to Analysis Server for the deployment feature. I can check that by right-clicking on the Analysis Server icon, going to Properties, looking at Security, and making sure that they've been added in. Now this is an admin. If they hadn't been added in, I could right-click, put in whatever name that was. Oops. Check to see if it's there, and say OK, and add them in. Once that's done, they will be able to build, deploy, and process. It's a very long video, but I gotta tell you, I get this question probably 2 or 3 times a week. How do I troubleshoot going through and making my analysis server behave? Hopefully these tips will be useful to you long term. And I wish you all the luck in the world of getting this thing up and going. It really isn't magic. It's just a matter of breaking it down to its little constituent components and checking them one by one. Good luck and have fun. Take care.